Hello, everybody. Jessica Nadav with this week's Devar Torah for parashat Lech Lecha. In the first 11 chapters of the book of Bereshit, we see God's disappointment with the behavior of each successive generation and how he punishes them. We see this in the story of Adam and Chava in their sin in Gan Eden. We see this in Cain's murder of Hevel, in the corruption of the generation of the flood, and finally the building of the Tower of Babel, which we spoke about last week. This theme abruptly changes in this week's parasha, as the focus of Sefer Bereshit now changes to God's choice of Avraham Avinu to become the forefather of his special nation. The parasha starts with God telling Abraham to leave his land, his birthplace, and his father's house, in other words, all that's familiar to him, and to go to a land that God will show him. There he'll be made a great nation, and the whole world will be blessed through him. And, quote, Avram went as God had spoken to him. Lovely. All fine and dandy, but who is this person Avram? We've only had a very quick mention of him in last week's parasha as part of a list of people whose ancestry is described. With Noah, for example, the Torah informs us at the outset why he's been chosen. Noah, we are told, was, quote, a righteous man, perfect in his generations. Noah walked with God. So we're told the purpose for him being chosen, because God saw the wickedness of man, and he, so to speak, reconsidered having created man at all. We're told that he decided to dissolve man, but, quote, Noah found favor in the eyes of Hashem. So Noah was chosen for the purpose of recreation. So we know why and we know the purpose. But here, the Torah never informs us why Abraham, or for what purpose Hashem has chosen him. We're told nothing about his qualifications for the job. His background remains a mystery. All we know about Abraham, or Avram as he was called then, like, for example, him breaking his father's idols or being thrown into the furnace by Nimrod, those stories that we were told at primary school, all we know about him is only through Midrashim. The Torah itself is silent. Why is this? Surely he must have had a spiritual journey we could learn from, right? Wouldn't the narrative flow a bit better if we knew a bit more about the main character? Why he was singled out for this mission? Why he deserves such an awesome privilege and responsibility? And yet the Torah, in its wisdom, chose to keep silent. Why? So the Rambam in his Mishneh Torah explains the decline of monotheism and the growth of idolatry that preceded Avraham Avinu. He explains it as an attempt to worship Hashem gone wrong. People worshipped intermediaries, if you will, of Hashem, but they accepted the existence of Hashem. In other words, they accepted that he existed, but they worshipped through intermediaries. And eventually they forgot about Hashem and worshipped only the intermediaries. Then in walks Avraham Avinu. He questions intellectually the concept of idol worship. He debates, he argues, he breaks idols, and publicizes that there is only one God. But we know that there were others who thought as Abraham did. Enosh, for example, thought like Abraham. Shem thought like Abraham. So what's the big deal with Abraham? Why is he credited with this ideological revolution? Ra'avad, in his commentary on Hilchot Avodah Zarah, asks a similar question. He answers that whilst other tzaddikim rebuked their contemporaries, they could not break the idols because the idol worshippers hid them. Only Abraham, he says, could find them. Now, this is a bit difficult to understand. Is he saying that Abraham was just a better detective than the others? Also, what does he mean by they hid their idols? What does that mean? We know they worshipped idols publicly. They had temples. According to the Midrash, Abraham had an idol shop. They weren't hidden. So to understand this a bit better, let's re-examine what the Rambam said. The Rambam, as I said before, said that idol worship was originally a well-intentioned mistake, the worship of intermediaries as a misguided way of honoring Hashem, of honoring God. When Ra'avad says that the idol worshippers hid their idols, he doesn't mean they physically hid them. He means they hid them spiritually. They made out like they were honoring Hashem, cloaking their sins in virtue. Before Abraham, no one was able to expose the sham. And that's what Ravad means when he says no one else could smash the idols. Abraham's unique ability was to distinguish between good and bad, light and darkness. He could invite any stranger into his home and yet, when necessary, distance himself completely from his own flesh and blood, from his nephew Lot, for example. He says to Lot they must separate, quote, for we are brothers. Rashi explains that they had to separate because they looked alike, and Abraham didn't want his true righteousness to be confused with Lot's apparent righteousness. If we asked anyone to name a non-kosher animal, most people would immediately say the pig. Why? There are plenty of other non-kosher animals. Of all the non-kosher animals, the pig has always symbolized impurity for the Jewish people, precisely because it has the external signs of a kosher animal, cloven hooves. As Jews, we are most repelled by ideologies that are cloaked in righteousness, but which are distortions of Torah. It is our job as descendants of Avraham Avinu to discern truth from falsehood, light from darkness. As I mentioned in last week's Devar Torah, the Tower of Babel is a perfect preface for the story of Avraham Avinu. It is also a stark contrast. In the story of Babel, the whole point is for the people to make a name for themselves, lest they be scattered. So they want to make a name for themselves, otherwise they're going to be scattered, they say. The outcome of the building of the Tower of Babel is midah keneged midah, measure for measure. Not one single person makes a name for themselves, and there is not one single name mentioned in the entire story, and they are scattered. Abraham, in contrast, is not trying to make a name for himself. On the contrary, his whole raison d'etre is to honor Hashem's name, and the outcome, midah keneged midah, measure for measure, is that Hashem makes his name great. Abraham's mission is Lech Lecha, to go for himself. He can be trusted to go for himself because for Abraham, going for himself means to go for Hashem. Abraham seems to have no ego. And from the first Lech Lecha to the end of Vayera, next week's parashat, the last Lech Lecha in the Akedah story, Abraham will go from trial to trial. Abraham's whole life is a journey. He is forging a path. Where Noah was chosen to recreate, Abraham's mission is to redirect mankind and to be the forefather of the Jewish generation. Until parashat Lech Lecha, until this week's parasha, Abraham has known Hashem only from a purely intellectual analysis of the world. In Lech Lecha, in this week's parasha, when Hashem revealed himself to him, an unbreakable connection is forged. And it is this union, this connection that we inherit, no matter what kind of Jew we are. And that is another reason why it makes sense that we come from a person with no ego, no desire to make a name for himself, and someone who accepted everyone. Name, status, and ego doesn't matter to him. And we inherit this wonderful heritage, no matter what kind of Jews we are like. Shabbat Shalom.